And welcome everyone to our panel today. Thank you all for being here. And we are going to go ahead and get started as everyone gets situated with a welcome message. I'll give you a rundown of the quick agenda here. We're going to open up the space, get a welcome message for everyone. Then we'll have Israel Juarez share some words, and then we'll dive into the panel with some opportunities for Q&A towards the end. So please feel free to add to the chat box anything that you might have as there too. Just for the sake of clarity and transparency, this is being recorded, so everything that's shared in the chat box or shared via audio or video is recorded. So with that, I'll turn it over to Monique Miles.
Thank you so much for that, Juan, and greetings, everyone. My name is Monique Miles, and I'm a vice president at the Aspen Institute, where I have the privilege of co-leading the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions and Opportunity Youth Forum and Fun in partnership with Melody Barnes and Juan Martinez. The mission of the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions is to promote collaborative community-based efforts that build the power and influence of those with the least access to opportunity. We support communities to come together to expand mobility, eliminate systemic barriers, and create their own solutions to their most pressing challenges. And it is an honor to be here with you all today. For old friends who have joined us today, you know that the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions, most especially the Opportunity Forum and Fun, is deeply committed to addressing structural inequity in place. Since the founding of our program back in 2012, we have invested more than $30 million into rural, urban, and tribal communities with the aim to remove structural barriers to opportunity that have created disparate generational outcomes, most especially for our country's most vulnerable youth and young adults, most especially for our country's Black and Indigenous young people of color. For new friends joining us today, connecting the topic of advancing racial equity with environmental justice could not have come at a more important time. Because you see, while we have always been committed to advancing education and career outcomes in place, dismantling oppressive systems in place, we recognize that many places, most especially the places where Black and Indigenous people of color have historically lived, also function as the structural container of inequity that drives intersectional generational disparities. And so our aim, our work has grown and our impact has deepened over the past several years, because what we aim to do is to connect the dots between our commitment to racial equity and our commitment to the environment. By closely examining place in the broader ecosystem in which youth and young adults live and work, we aim to shine a spotlight on the range of environmental injustices our communities face, including a lack of access to quality food, inadequate, unreliable transportation, air pollution, water pollution, and unsafe housing, just to name a few barriers. But you see, shining a spotlight on these structural injustices is only part of the story. Given the intersection of race and place, including the historical policies that have inextricably linked race to zip code and thereby lifetime outcomes, the true and complete narrative about place requires us to also shine a spotlight on the power of community, the power of youth and young adults on the front lines of organizing at the intersections of racial equity and environmental justice. These leaders are working to harness community powers. The leaders and speakers before you today are working to deepen impact and sustain momentum for this work in the months and years ahead. These leaders will share reflections on current policy and research, including lessons learned from driving cross-system and sector collaborative work aimed at dismantling environmental injustices and advancing racial equity for and with Black and Indigenous youth and young adults. These leaders are working across the pandemics of climate change, the healthcare crisis, anti-Black violence, and the economic downturn to advance community wellness that centers the voices and the vision of our young people. Today's session is committed to lifting up these voices. And so, without further ado, it is an honor to turn this over to Israel, one of our young leaders and partners in this important work. But before doing so, I want to thank you all for being here with us today and for being partners in this important work. Thank you. Israel?
Thank you, Monique, and thank you everybody for having me. My name's Israel. Here's my poem. As city grows and mountains lessen, the pain of civilization hits me in the chest like falling off your bike for the first time. I see the world of beauty and pain punching me in the face like a bully at lunch. I'm seeking for love, justice in the world where red, blue could send shots at you. Walk away clean, blessed, I chew. The pain of society runs in my head. I want to live more. I want to grow like a garden, watered every day, not hanging to pain in the slums. I see opportunities in one corner and homelessness in the other. I seen this all before the pandemic, just the tip of the iceberg. I'm afraid to walk outside or walk in my own skin in my city, ran by addiction, high, and I lost most of my friends to suicide and overdose. Then I seen go to college or buy a home. Truth of the city. We love our friendship stuff. We love ourselves. Change material objects. From us screaming worth, self, YOLO, living once. Like you can't take it when you die. As nature lessens, we are blinded by cigarette smokes and tear gas. I miss the smell of growing trees, mountain airs, and hanging next to the outdoors. Instead, we scream in development in a fast-living city. I am a son of a dreamer, just trying to make a dollar off hope and ambition. As we build the roads to drive, my dad is still in fear like he's illegal. In the land that he helped build to break his back for the dollars and crumbs of fear, fear of vice, fear of being brown, fear of his life, fear of separation, fear that his children and wife is something he won't come back to. The blood, sweat, and tears in my roots. For years of soldiers run in my vein. I've seen both sides of the coin. One in a jail cell, the other in the suit next to a CEO in Aspen. Made me realize the power of place. I was no longer on the bottom looking up. I was in a position speaking for my people and screaming like a lion at the top of the city for the fallen angels we lost. Here's my love. Here's my halo hanging over my head to uplift the world, even if it's for a second. I want to take away the pain. I want to see more love, more self-love, more care, more love in the work, more love in community, more love in self, more love in harmony, more love in peace. Visionary.
Israel, that was phenomenal. It really, really was. I mean, just the opportunity to sit and to listen to your words and the power with which you shared them with us and the message that you shared with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're honored by that.
I was anxious writing that song. It's good to see that it reflected back beautifully.
It did. It really did. I just was sitting here kind of letting it wash over me. It was really powerful. Thank you. And Monique, also thank you for your leadership and for your words, bringing us all into this space together. Everyone, my name is Melody Barnes, and I am just thrilled to be with you this afternoon. And in particular, because we have a wonderful and knowledgeable panel to discuss an important and timely issue. I think Monique and Israel both captured the import of our discussion today. I will say to you what I think you probably well know, that the environmental justice movement addresses a statistical fact. People who live, work, and play in America's most polluted environments are commonly people of color, and many of them are poor. And that's no accident. Data shows that communities of color are regularly targeted to host facilities that have negative environmental impacts, whether it's a landfill or a dirty industrial plant or a truck depot, for example, and the list goes on and on. I remember when I first became acquainted with this issue many, many years ago and reading about and talking to people who were living in some of the most dire circumstances, their environments made and created in such a way that it was impossible for them to raise their families in a healthy and sustainable way. Because those who bear the brunt of the environmental degradation and others who have their same concerns have been working on these issues for many, many years, trying to work to address both the causes and the outcomes. And certainly young adults from impacted neighborhoods are some of the leaders in this effort and helping to show us the way forward. And for all of us, their leadership is a win-win-win. While doing important work, those young adults are also gaining critical life and professional skills, collaborative problem solving, and community organizing. They're becoming civic leaders. They are civic leaders and showing deep respect for the culture and traditions of their peers and neighbors. And so today, we want to talk about what's happening at the confluence of these issues, of environmental issues and racial justice issues. And that's why I'm thrilled that we're going to be in conversation with three people who can only be called experts. We're going to have a chance to hear from Christy Goldfuss, who's the Senior Vice President for Energy and Environmental Policy at the Center for American Progress. During the Obama administration, she was a colleague of mine, and she served as Managing Director of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, where she helped to develop and implement the Obama administration's environmental and energy policies, including the Climate Action Plan. We've also got Erik Stegman, who serves as Executive Director of Native Americans in Philanthropy, a national organization advocating for stronger and more meaningful investments by the philanthropic sector in tribal communities. Erik also served as the Executive Director for the Center for Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute, so he was a colleague.
I found this on the web.
Oh, sorry. Siri decided to participate in this conversation too. Yeah, I bet you all didn't know about Siri's expertise in environmental justice. But in any case, back to Erik, who was a colleague at the Aspen Institute, also majority staff counsel for the US Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and in the Obama administration as a policy advisor at the US Department of Education. And finally, Juan Martinez Pineda, a senior program manager at the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions and co-founder of Fresh Tracks. Juan has over 15 years of nonprofit management and implementation of strategy and was named a National Geographic Explorer in 2011 for his work to engage the rising generation of youth to the healing power of the out of doors. So I'm thrilled that you all are with us and that we have your expertise this afternoon. So I want to start out just by helping our audience get to know the three of you. So Christy, Erik, and Juan, I was wondering if you could share a short personal story that tells us why you do this work, why it's so important to you. Why don't I start out? Christy, do you want to give us a start?
Thanks everybody for having me. This is a really wonderful conversation to be having today, especially since we're at this pivotal week with Earth Day on Thursday, but really the World Leaders Climate Summit happening on Thursday and Friday as well. This is a really exciting time for the country, really, in our discussion about environmental justice, climate change, and really addressing the multiple crises that President Biden talks about all of the time. So thank you for having me here. Why do I do the work? First of all, at this point, it is work, but it's really a passion. I think I would just point to a point during our former boss, President Obama's time in office, where I was on the outside. And we were being a little critical in 2012 that conservation and protecting public lands and waters was really not part of the agenda in a way that at the time I was still a CAP, that we thought it could be and should be, especially leading up to the centennial of the National Park Service. And so we started with the concept of how do we build the story around what these places are, why they matter, and how that could connect to the centennial. So we almost called them starter national monuments, like Fort Monroe, other places that are key to our history, but really about the historic moments in time, not necessarily the conservation moments in time, to build the goodwill so that the Obama administration at that time could embrace them. And starting out on the outside, we went and visited communities and built relationships with youth members and built relationships with civic leaders and really dug in deep on what are the stories that the country needs to know more about and that we could build support for. And we started with that particular strategy of really understanding what were the untold parts of our history and how could we connect them to a conservation agenda that then would include everyone in the centennial of the National Park Service and the story that we needed to tell around our country. And that led to, at the end of the day, President Obama ended up being the president who has protected the most land and water in history of the United States, and was truly proud of it and saw it as a deep part of his overall climate agenda, which is something we now see President Biden taking to the next level. So being able to witness social change, being a part of it, recognizing that none of that could have happened without the community voices on the ground who were really expressing those stories. This was something that President Trump tried very hard to undo, and he couldn't because of the power of those communities and the people who loved those places. So it was transformative, historic, but it keeps me alive and really thinking that we can do more and social change is possible if you have that support from communities and if you have that ability to really recognize people's leadership on the ground. They hold and protect the change that we all want to see.
Wow, that was really powerful and beautifully told, and I think is a strong message about how important this is to us as a cultural matter and in communities, and it is about the power of place. Erik, why don't I turn to you next and have you share your story? Why do you do the work that you do?
Thanks, Melody. It's great to see you again, and much gratitude to Israel for that beautiful opening. I'm always appreciative to have our young people centering these kinds of conversations right at the beginning. And yeah, I mean, this has been a life work for me. My great-grandfather is from the Carry the Kettle Nakota First Nation, and my grandfather was actually one of the first American Indian dentists working out on the Blackfeet Reservation where my mother grew up as a little kid. And, you know, my entire mother's side of the family is a product of the intentional cultural destruction that our communities have dealt with over generations. My great-grandfather was forcibly removed from his family, sent to a boarding school in Canada, part of a system that was here in the US and Canada, with the intention to assimilate our people, to beat them for speaking their language. My grandfather actually used to hate the Mounties, and I never really understood why until I was older. I grew up watching Dudley Do-Right, where I grew up in Seattle, and I only years later found out that they were in charge of rounding up all the runaway Native kids and putting them in solitary confinement back in their schools. So that's where my family came from, and I don't really know a lot more before that. I've been back to the reserve up in Canada. My great-grandfather hated it and started a new life here in the US where he ran away. But those were policies that were very intentional, using these systems to really take apart our culture and to disconnect Native people from their culture. And I share all of that because it's central to everything about our work as Native people is the role of culture. And one of the reasons I care so deeply about this work when it comes to climate conservation and our lands and waterways is that I think for too long, the nonprofit sector in the environmental world and the climate world has been functioning in many of those same Western silos that my great-grandfather had to deal with. It was about disconnecting people from their land. Our culture is inextricably tied to the land. And too often I'm used to conservation campaigns and others that's just about protecting every square foot of a certain special place, but we hardly ever hear about the people. And I think for communities of color across the country, they've felt that they were disconnected from those stories and disconnected from the land as well. And I think Native people have been organizing for a long time. And I think especially with our young people, when you look at movements like Standing Rock and others, they are really working to not just reconnect their people to their cultures by learning language and a lot of other important things, but they're also about reconnecting to our land, our waterways, and making sure that the people and the culture that are at the center of that story are there again. And I hope that as we continue to have these conversations, that we're listening to those young people who are working with their elders to think about this more holistically. And I think Native people have a lot to say in that space. So just really excited to be part of this conversation.
Absolutely. Well said. And thank you for sharing your family story with us. It is a powerful one. It is an important one for everyone to know and to understand as part of our history, as well as that of Canada's. Juan, why don't I turn to you? Why do you do this work? And how has that led to the creation of Fresh Tracks?
Yeah, I think part of the reason why I do this work starts with me growing up in this country as a dreamer and coming to this country and finding out that part of my identity was not welcomed or seen as other than, and struggling with that as I was growing up to find places where I belonged. And one of the things that my mom and dad did early on was anywhere we would go, they would always find the the ground, the dirt, the place to set roots. And we would always plant the garden. For us, it wasn't urban gardening, it was survival when we couldn't make ends meet. So a lot of that was really this traditional knowledge that was passed down from my parents, that's ancestral and indigenous in its own and they were, unbeknownst to me, they were passing on the culture that carried on for many generations. And my dad would take us to Chavez Ravine, which has its own history of displacement and how it came to be. But in Chavez Ravine, there's this park, Elysian Park, where you can go to, and my dad would take us to this park and say, "This is your park," right? And he would let us play. And that in and of itself, that sense of authority and ownership for him to have that confidence to go in there as an immigrant man raising a family and say, "This is your park," like, that was powerful in and of itself for me to grow up with that sense of ownership, that this was part of my identity, my legacy, my ownership of this world. And then that's why I started to realize things like, when I sat under a tree and enjoying the shade of it, it wasn't asking me about my skin color. It wasn't, and when I was feeling the whisper of the wind, it wasn't asking me about for my papers or my documentation, and the sun wasn't looking at you for your bank account or your credit score. Like, for me, I realized that the mosquitoes really don't care who you are. They're gonna take what they need from you, right? But what I realized over the last 10 years, that even while I found this place in nature and the outdoors that didn't have this bias, didn't have these barriers to it, the systems and some of the systems and a lot of the people that steward these places do carry that bias and do carry those injustice and do carry that inequitable access to it, to the benefits of what the outdoors can provide. And for me, I think it's been a long journey to find the connections between my heart and soul and enjoying the beauty and the power of mountains and how to share that with others and to see them grow through that, and the beauty and power in our communities and connecting those two dots together and finding that place. And that's where I think the root of Fresh Tracks really comes from, that when we found that there was this healing power in bringing cultures together and breaking silos, and that setting and that background being the great outdoors, something powerful happens, and those relationships carry on for many years beyond just the sense of our program, and carry on to fruitful relationships and friendships and partnerships, and have made a ripple effect of leadership now that stands in different places across the country. I think that's the power of where we start to do some of the good work, and that's essentially what keeps me coming day in and day out, and keeps me in the finance meetings and all the Zoom back-to-backs, because they are the reason that I do
it. Well said. When we all feel like the mundane has pulled us down a little too far, we can lift our heads up and see the broader reasons for what we're doing. And Juan, I just want you to maybe go a little bit deeper on that point. You were talking about some of the human connections, and in thinking about how programs like Fresh Tracks and others can use the outdoors as a backdrop to promote the cultural connection, but also civic engagement, and ultimately to close opportunity gaps. I mean, that is an issue that we have put on the forefront, or many of us have, and we are trying to figure out every way we can to try and tackle it and wrestle it to ground and close those gaps. How can these kinds of programs do that work?
Yeah, so I think for a long time, outdoor programs have been seen as really a sense of getting people out to places. And that's kind of where it stopped. And it went no further, just introduce people. And there was this savior mentality to it, that if you introduce people to it, that they will get a better life for X, Y, Z reasons. And that's where it stopped and what I've come to realize, and what we're starting to recognize through data, qualitative and quantitative, is that when you introduce young people with a sense of the land and to connect that to their own culture, whether they are from that land or have a connection to their land through their own traditions and history, they are more likely to have self-awareness, self-leadership, development of their own efficiencies, and be able to advocate for themselves. And that's a sense of what we try to steward in those kind of moments and spaces, to bring people together and say, this is your legacy. This is all part of who we are as a country now. And even that in of itself, the history of the national parks and how public lands come to be, interrogating that history and how it's how a lot of it is based in violence and disconnecting the native and indigenous peoples from those lands and itself, and acknowledging that history and reconciliating with it as well too. So put all of that in there and then say, how can we move forward? What is the power in your hands right now to make a difference? And that's where we start to hone in around where can we start to provide, not develop the leaders, but provide the tools for the leaders that are already there. And oftentimes, and I credit a friend and mentor, Martin LeBlanc, has always said, these are not the leaders of tomorrow, they're the leaders of today, and really seeing them as that, and putting authority and putting them closer to the power so that they can make the change that they see for the future. That's where we start to see that advocacy and to start to break down some of the silos. So one of the things that we know is that the National Park Service or public land agencies in general are predominantly older and white and male. And so increasing opportunities and exposing leaders, young people, diverse, that are reflective of the American fabric, to those opportunities to be able to represent those public lands as well too, and to make some of the changes from the inside that we all want and see too. So creating those opportunities, closing those opportunity gaps, and it never goes without saying that part of the accountability there is to connect people with the resources. And so that's something that I always hold myself accountable to make sure that I'm not just introducing people to a nice park, but introducing them to an opportunity to either benefit and apply for a job at that park, or manage the finances for that park and that city, and go on their routes to being accountants, but being able to increase that horizon for them as well too.
Yeah, broadening.
Melody, can I just add one?
Please.
So Juan has made Fresh Tracks into this incredible program, but even before Juan had the reins of the program, really it was Valerie Jarrett who pushed us when we were first thinking about this to think beyond those. I can't even remember the transformative moment that you supposedly had when you were in the woods. And then, if you have that transformative moment, you go back home, your parents still don't have the means to take you back out there. You're still in that situation. So she pushed us very hard to think about, how do you connect what that experience is into closing that opportunity gap, thinking about, can you then take it and turn it into an employment opportunity, take it into a leadership opportunity? So there were a couple of different designs, but then Juan really was able to put lots of tools on the table to connect that outdoor experience to civic engagement and to leadership, which has really made Fresh Tracks into even more than we ever could have imagined at that time.
Yeah. It's like holding a jewel up to the light, and you see there are lots of different facets to it. It's not one dimensional, even when that one dimension is very special, that there are lots of different benefits. And Erik, thinking about those benefits, one of the things this, I think, comes out in all of the things that you all said, but when Juan was just talking about the benefits for young people, when you talk about the importance of collaboration, and Indigenous youth, urban, rural, Native youth, when there's an opportunity in programs like this to work together, to work around issues of the environment, to develop collaborative problem solving across cultural differences. Talk more about what you've seen in that vein and the benefits that are coming out of that kind of work.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. I share Christy's gratitude to Juan and the others who helped really move this program to where it was. I remember when I first met Juan when I was running the Center for Native American Youth over at Aspen, and it was just after they had finished the pilot project, the 2-week cross-cultural exchange with Witch and youth in Compton, California, after they had just gotten back from the White House. And it was the moment I've been waiting for. This was the kind of program I felt like our young people have been needing for a long time. And the main reason for that is that I really do believe that centering culture, along with really leveraging nature as an organizing and healing platform, was the real key for actual systems change. And they had shown that through this program. And I think one of the things that doesn't always come out, I think Juan illustrates it beautifully with his story and his experience, is that so many of our young people are caught in these systems like the juvenile justice system, the child welfare system. I mean, too many systems to even name where people of color and Native people are disproportionately in all of them. But they're also dealing with judgment and so many other issues back in their own communities. And I think there's so many times when I've been doing youth leadership programs just in our own Indigenous communities, and the minute you can get those young people into a space where they're free of that judgment and they're free of those day-to-day fears and challenges, so they can really open up and be themselves, is sort of the first step. And nature is an amazing way to do that. But the next step is to really help facilitate that cross-cultural learning. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that's hard work. That has to be really intentional. And I remember one of our Fresh Tracks trainings that we were running in New Mexico a couple of years ago with about 30 or 40 youth. It was the Native youth at the campfire one night that were sharing their culture. Part of the Fresh Tracks curriculum is about sharing culture. And they were sharing beadwork and songs and a stick game. And then all of a sudden you started seeing these other youth of color really realizing, wait, I have culture too. And they would share their step dance from their sorority or, any number of other things. And you could just feel the power outside with other young people of color who had just been through a training around overcoming implicit bias among one another. And that's the hard work it takes. But I think that hard work is so much easier when you're in a place like the natural environment, because we've known for a long time that that's where we thrive. Native people have a lot of wisdom that goes a long ways back, as do a lot of other Indigenous peoples around the world. So you're putting that all together, you're breaking down the systems. And once you break down those systems, our young people thrive. And it's actually not that surprising.
Yeah. I don't know, Christy or Juan, if there's anything that you want to add to that, but Erik, as you were talking, it was almost like a film playing out in my mind of conversations that I've had or that I've overheard as the young adults who work with our program are with us out in Aspen, which, is just the Rockies, as we all know, is just stunningly gorgeous, and people are hiking and connecting in the outdoors, and those conversations and engagements reflect so much of what you're saying, and that can happen all over the country. Christy, one of the things that you were talking about earlier, you were talking about investments that were made by the Obama administration. And then you said, and the Biden administration is taking this to the next level. And I'm wondering if you could share how these really historic environmental adjustment, I'm merging two words into one. Environmental justice investments are helping build power in communities that have been marginalized, that have been pushed to the side in previous times.
this was one of the many historic moments on the campaign for President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris. He actually spoke about environmental injustice and described it on a national platform in a way that it had never been given that much attention. But there is now a serious recognition of whether it's redlining or permitting of industrial facilities, everything that you listed at the top, that there was an intentionality around that that led to specific communities of color, disadvantaged communities being impacted time and time again. I always think of this community in Louisiana, Mossville, which is right in Cancer Alley, and they're going to have 12 petrochemical plants surrounding this teeny town that has incidents of cancer that far outpace what you would traditionally see across this country. And no surprise, it's a predominantly African-American community. So it's, while some people don't want to recognize these connections, I think now, whether it's as a result of the pandemic or just too many data points coming together at once, the racial crisis, the climate crisis, the all of this has really just made it so we see that there are some communities that we need to focus on. And place was such a part of the Obama administration. We had started to explore some of the strategies of how do we use all the federal programs to invest in communities so that we can make a difference there. Now, with the environmental justice focus, there will be a clear intentionality, whether it's the Justice 40 commitment or looking at an environmental justice lens, to make sure that all of those tools that the federal government has can be used collectively to, I mean, we're never going to correct for those wrongs, but to offer up a different future that addresses not only the terrible injustices from the past, but allows for an opportunity in the future. So it's tied to a climate agenda because that's the future we have to build. And these are the communities that suffer when we talk about hurricanes or wildfires and have the least ability to recover. But it really is about economic development and opportunity and correcting for the wrongs of the past. And that was just not how we thought about it then. And now with Cecilia Martinez as the Senior Director for Environmental Justice at CEQ, and this serious commitment from the administration to do this, it's hard. This is going to be, I mean, it's a very difficult way to allocate dollars and make sure programs are delivering for communities. But it's a completely different approach than we had even in the Obama administration.
Yeah, that is hugely exciting. And I felt that sensation we were talking about the challenges involved. And I did a flashback and, turning the mechanisms of government, particularly when they have been operating in a particular way for a long time, is really, really difficult. But the ability to do that is game changing. And it starts with the intentionality from the top and the message that gets sent and ripples down all the way through government to be able to do that. But it also requires, I think, a different way of thinking from everyone, that these aren't siloed issues, that, I care about the environment because I care about the environment, and I care about economic development over here, and I care about, youth development over here. The opportunity to bring all these pieces together is really, really powerful. And Juan, I'm curious, when through the lens of Fresh Tracks, what makes you excited about that kind of intentionality and that kind of investment? What do you hope for when you hear about that?
Yeah, I think one of the big notes of hope is just the historic naming of the first Native American woman to the Secretary of Interior office, and an office and a public land agency and a public land legacy that has so many wrongs in it, that this one piece of a right is so historic that I think it just overwhelms me and a lot of people about what can we do now in this moment and with this time that we have in front of us. And I think about the about all the intersection. I think about 1964. So 1964, the Wilderness Act and passed, and the Civil Rights Act passed. And what would have happened if those two pockets of change agents would have talked to each other, collaborated a lot more, talked about like what can be? I think we would be in a different place now. And so that's the kind of opportunity that I think we're in today, that there's these silos that are more willing to be broken down, to challenge the way that we've done things in the past, to look at innovative and creative solutions, and to put the people who have been closest to the pain, closest to the power, something that Representative Ayanna Pressley has always said, and I credit her with, you know, being inspired by her words there, that this is a moment for truly some of the communities who have been most disenfranchised, most disconnected, most impacted negatively by a lot of the decisions in the past, to be drivers and change agents. And I consider myself part of just making sure that those on-ramps and those opportunities are made available through programs like Fresh Tracks, through other programs across the country like Natural Leaders Network and Center for Native American Youth and Generation Indigenous and My Brother's Keeper, all these new generations of leadership that is just, that one is already leading, but and now is in a position to really stand up and say, we're in a position to say, what do you need to do this change? What do you need to drive this forward? And so as I start to read the executive orders that are coming out of President Biden's office, I just get really excited with that vulnerability of the administration to say, we don't know everything, but we're going to work to do that, to make more of those opportunities available for us to listen and to hear and to take the lead from the community. That just signals an entirely holistic approach of how we can do this and really truly live up to the democracy that we all envision in a way.
Yeah, well, really, really wonderfully said. And I'm curious in taking on that challenge. And Erik, I want to ask you this question, given your experience with philanthropy, because we've talked some about government and the important role that government can play. But what do you think, and how do you see philanthropy playing a role here? How can they partner with the federal government to build out support in urban and rural communities to tackle the climate crisis with this focus on young adults? What's possible here?
There's so much possible. And I think especially right now, I mean, there's so much exciting opportunity, you know, on the federal side under the leadership of President Biden and Secretary Holland and so many others. I mean, I can't believe so many of the people I work with day to day have all stepped into the administration. I mean, there's Native people everywhere. It's great. But philanthropy, you know, that's so much of our work right now. I think when I officially stepped into this role over a year ago, I was actually not as familiar with the amazingly deep silos between like climate funders and conservation funders. Makes no sense to any person in my world, you know, who's just on the ground as an organizer or an activist, as a Native person.
Or to me, it makes no sense to anyone, to be clear.
And also a lot of the other policy people, and everyone just seems to agree on that. So we're like, okay, well, we're going to do what we can to raise our voice to say this is ridiculous. You are holders of so much money, and a lot of the roots of that money in a lot of those foundations is due to people who've been forcibly removed from their land, genocide, slavery, you name it. So there's a certain duty there. But without having to focus on that, I think this is about thinking like, how can we be partners with you, whether you're at a foundation or a donor advised fund or whatever it might be, to think about how can we move that capital into these more holistic approaches that are really going to be filling in the gaps where government can't. I think, you know, part of this is really helping funders in general better understand policy. I mean, too often, I don't have to tell Christy this, it's really hard to help a lot of funders really understand the important role of policy. But there's all sorts of big areas that government can't help with. In our world, a lot of it is community planning. You know, we've already been hearing about, you know, whether you're in an urban community or a tribal rural reservation community, you can't go out and find federal grants that are really going to help you bring your elders together with your young people to talk about what's your big vision for your community and where does the environment actually fit into that. That's where philanthropy should be investing some dollars. They should be investing in programs like Fresh Tracks that are really bringing organizers together in the outdoors. So we're really trying to help with that. And I think the other big part is we're helping educate them about the unique role of where tribes really belong in this. So if you take the 30 by 30 conservation initiative, there's tremendous energy in philanthropy right now, but not all those funders understand how to engage tribal nations and tribal governments in their specific nation to nation status, how to engage Native youth in the right way. A lot of times they fund these large white-led green nonprofits that honestly don't have much experience or trust in our communities, rather than funding Native-led organizations. So we're really trying to do a lot of work to build the tables to help bring Native people together, to educate those funders and to create those vehicles to drive that funding. And I think for other communities of color, these networks and coalitions like the Forum on Community Solution and Fresh Tracks are an ideal place to really bring a very diverse set of stakeholders, philanthropy, government, and organizers together, so we can actually take advantage of these big opportunities that are on the horizon now, especially with the new administration.
That was great. Christy, it looks like.
I'm sorry, I'm chomping at the bit at this one.
Yes, I can tell. Go.
As much as we've seen the federal government at the top have this dramatic shift in approach that Juan was talking about and Erik was talking about, it's hard. I mean, philanthropy wants to be able to measure the impact. So it was about how many acres were protected, what was the tons of emissions that were avoided, how many coal-fired power plants did you actually shut down?
Mm-hmm.
And all of that can be measured and counted and sort of served up as a product that you've achieved or a deliverable that you've achieved. But what we saw on the climate side of this is a decade of extraordinary losses with that focus. I mean, whether it's Waxman Markey or whether it was the clean electricity standard that Bingaman put out there was never a focus from the climate perspective on who are the people that are going to benefit, who are the people who are suffering. And if you don't have communities seeing how they benefit from the policy solutions you put in place, they're never going to stick. So it's very challenging now where we see all the intersection to figure out how do you measure in the same way for philanthropy, what you're delivering, what that social impact is, and what is the change. I mean, the amount of policy that needs to be developed right now for this decade, for the next 2 decades, is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, during the Obama administration, when I came out, I had funders tell me, we don't need any more policy. We need a carbon tax and then we'll be done with it. That's just not the approach anymore. And so how do we match measuring impact, which is incredibly important from a philanthropic perspective and just in general, and the intersection of what we know is essential to make social change stick and to have people a part of a climate policy or an environmental policy. And people are changing very quickly in the philanthropic world on the climate side. But I think this is going to be a real struggle. And how can we take advantage of the opening that President Biden has given us here from the philanthropic perspective to, once we know how we're going to use an environmental justice screen, where are those communities? Can philanthropic dollars do what Erik is just talking about and have advisors on the ground or community organizers on the ground that connect all those disparate programs? Because try as they might, the government is a very big ship and it's going to take time, as you know, to move it. And so where can philanthropy, make things happen a little faster on the ground so we can demonstrate results? Because if that does not happen in the next 4 years, I mean, not only do I fear for our party or for the Democratic Party, I fear for democracy overall, because we have got to deliver on these major crises if we're going to show that this type of government actually works.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the clock, but there are a couple of questions I want to ask. I want to pick up on something that has been raised in the chat, because because I think it's a great question. It really resonates with me also personally. Person is asking, how can we bring national attention to the environmental justices in our community? We're a product of the failed implementation of one of the largest urban renewal programs in US history, have the 5th largest Superfund site in the nation. We experience repetitive catastrophic flooding and no one provides assistance. And so that's I think a smart question. How do we bring focus and attention to this issue so that we can, going back to what you all are just saying, you measure what matters, but what are you really measuring? It's not just removal of X or, we've got more of Y. It's what are the benefits to people and what's the quality of life for people? Are people healthy and well? And I think about, this is the reason it resonates for me personally. My great grandparents owned farmland in Richmond. Christy and I were talking about our shared Richmond connection. I live in Richmond now. That land now, on that land now sits one of the large public housing communities in Richmond. For anybody who knows about urban renewal in Richmond, lots of Black and brown people, mainly Black people, forced out of their houses, few put back, highways circling these housing projects, and a lot of underinvestment in those communities. Last year, I think the New York Times did a big story about the heat sinks and featured Richmond in that. Just a lot of environmental degradation along the lines, I think, of what this person is describing. How do we bring attention to that so that it supports and encourages what the government is now doing, encourages philanthropy in the way that you all were describing, encourages other environmental groups to also champion these causes? What are your thoughts about getting people to focus on these issues?
I can add a quick thought here, and that's one of our partners, the Annie Casey Foundation, came to us and started asking, how do you measure well-being, and started to really center youth and young adult well-being. And we said, here's the ways that we've started to measure some of this and start to address silo breaking. And then we started to get into a conversation around who's doing the asking and who's creating those questions, and who's advocating for those resources. And that has sparked an entire new arm of our project and our work to really center those communities who are most impacted and closest to these issues, to start to put the tools in their hands so that they can then not only start to identify indicators of well-being for their communities, but to also then take those identifiers, take those indicators, and start to advocate for the policies that create that well-being mechanism, to create those well-being resources for the communities to be able to do that. And that's one way that I think about that. And the other way I think is good old community organizing. Like that, I think is so. I've taken it for granted just how much of that is ingrained through my parents and their times organizing in their youth, and how much of that I did in my early days organizing for housing rights and immigrant rights, and how much of that really needs to be integrated back into a lot of the work that we do, so that people, and I find myself guilty of this, don't consider a like or a signature on a petition community organizing. Like, that's great. That's one of the many one of the entirety ways of how we start to get back to the roots. And there's a reason why it's called grassroots organizing, because you really need to get down to the ground and do some of the stomping around and creative ways. And not to say that there isn't a new innovative way of doing organizing via tech and social media, there is. But I still think that face-to-face interaction, that getting to know your neighbors, galvanizing and mobilizing people to start to address those issues is something that's never gonna grow old. It is a fundamental piece of our democracy, I think, and how we try to get things done.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick question before I just ask you all to wrap up, before we go on to more Q&A. In a couple of your responses, you've referenced some of the major environmental groups, and I'm just curious what you think those organizations can learn from grassroots groups that are doing environmental justice work deep in communities. based on what you've seen, your experience, what's needed?
Erik, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I can keep this brief. I think that like so many things that I think have really come to clarity with a lot of the movements we've seen, with all the horrendous events that have been going on, I think a lot of people who don't come from these communities are starting to question the frame that they bring to the table, and the privilege, the perspective. And I urge a lot of those, particularly white-led environmental nonprofits, to apply that to how they're approaching community organizing, for instance, like Juan said, because one of the big issues is that there are so many different ways that we all connect with each other in our communities. You know, in Native communities, the entire cornerstone of our work at Native Americans in Philanthropy is our relations and our relationships with one another. We as Native people are deeply connected through families, through our elders, through our shared history and our stories and our cultures. And that's one of our strongest bases of power. And so we are by no means, going around just organizing on some environmental topic. When you looked at the COVID situation, we put out a report a couple of months ago just analyzing Native-led response efforts. And just in a short period of time, for the latter part of last year, we were able to document at least $38 million that were raised by Native-led organizations through mutual aid networks, GoFundMe campaigns, Native-led funding intermediaries. And so many of these organizations one day were, supporting youth programs and basketball and art and healing. And then the next day, everyone shifted to filling boxes full of food for elders and raising funds for their communities. And another day, they'll be working on an environmental justice issue. And I know this is the case in so many other communities and urban communities. The people that we're relying on are the census organizers, the ones trying to get the vote out, the ones doing direct service. And that does not translate neatly into one narrow mission around the environment. And so you really have to have humility when you come to this issue, when it comes to how you engage communities. And you need to identify every way possible that you can give up power and give up money to Native-led and people of color-led organizations if you're ever really going to get them behind the kind of goals that you're looking to achieve.
I would just add to that there is a real crisis happening across environmental organizations, reckoning with a history that was tied to white supremacy and really difficult questions about origins of environmentalism across this country. So that is happening, whether it's at the Sierra Club or any of the other major environmental organizations that you could name. We have led, in partnership with Cecilia Martinez, who our partner is now in the White House, the Equitable and Just National Climate Forum, to do just this, of bringing leaders from the environmental justice community together with the CEOs of the major environmental organizations. And that transfer of power, recognizing that we win when the EJ leaders are sitting in front of Chuck Schumer, using the access, using the fact that philanthropy really likes to give out big dollars. I mean, Bezos gave $100 million to NRDC, $100 million to a bunch of these different organizations, because they don't like doing little grants. So how do you then fundraise for the community organizations or use that money yourself? And so through the Equitable and Just Climate Forum, there were commitments made by the major environmental organizations to do business differently. And it has been very effective over the last 2 years. It's also, quite frankly, brought a lot of our partners to their knees. And we have to figure out how to take advantage of the resources. We need technical expertise. We need to know, data. So how do we mesh these, the expertise on the ground with what's inside these organizations to be effective? But it's a real challenge.
Well, thank you both for sharing that with us. And before I go kick this to Juan, I'm just hoping that each of you can very quickly, maybe I'll start with you, Erik, and then Christy, and then Juan, you can take it from there. but ending this part of our conversation with a word of encouragement or a call to action to youth leaders and others who are doing this work. What would you say? There are times when it feels really, really challenging and daunting, but what would you say to encourage their continued work in this area? Erik?
Sure. I mean, we're actually starting up a new Native Youth and Philanthropy leadership team, which I'm super excited about. And I think my message to young people would be everything you're doing to hit the streets and have been for a long time is making a difference. And it feels slow sometimes. But the fact that we're having these conversations about all these issues in philanthropy and government and the places that are the hardest to actually shift and change really matters. So now I really encourage you to think about how you can keep your momentum going in the streets as grassroots organizers, but also to ask, hey, philanthropy, I want to see at that table. I want to know how this money is moving. Or, your local elected officials and the Biden administration. There are so many new opportunities for you to step into other roles to speak directly to these systems and to have your voice matter. And you've got a lot of partners like us out there who are happy to go ruffle some feathers for you. So just think about all the different ways you can start using that voice in these systems beyond just what you're used to in your day-to-day, because it's all made a huge difference. And I'm super excited.
Nice.
I would just say Juan Martinez. I mean, this was an idea that was hatched. I mean, I hate to say, probably at a bar, that then came to in DC and came to be with the blessing of some smart folks in philanthropy and really President Obama and others within the White House recognizing the opportunity. And then Juan brought this idea to life. So if you ever question whether or not a person can make a difference, when you have a vision and a commitment and a passion for something, you can take a little teeny concept. I saw many of them die. I saw good ones that should have taken off, never take flight. And then I saw what Juan did with Fresh Tracks, and it's just amazing. So Juan Martinez, over to you.
Thanks, Christy. And thank you so much for those words. And everything that I do is in community. So wouldn't it be possible with a lot of the people that took the time to meet with me, took the time to fundraise, Children in Nature Network, Martin LeBlanc, CJ Golding, the early funders, Tom Campion Foundation, REI, and all of our new partners that have been there from the beginning and continue to be there and continue to join us in this call to action. And I think for me, when I think about that, it really is about part of the vision of Fresh Tracks was, President Obama going to Alaska and moving around those public lands in that community and getting a reminder about his community in Chicago. And as he was getting ready to launch My Brother's Keeper after Trayvon Martin's murder, that sense of like those dots can connect to each other, those communities can connect to each other. That's the same community that I'm trying to tap into or hone into or make into more of a reality, so that these systems of inequity stop preying on this assumed disconnect between our communities, whether Native, Indigenous, Black, Asian, mixed, and multicultural, or different issues, whether it's fighting incarceration or police brutality or immigrant rights. Like at the end of the day, these systems of inequality are relying on us being disconnected and disengaged from each other. And so what are the opportunities for us to say, this is what we can do together, and here's how we're going to do it, and put the power in the people who can get it done, which are those closest to the pain. And so that's really something that we're after, and this is one way that we're doing it, and recognizing that there's vulnerability in that as well too. So thank you so much, Melody. I am gonna transition us into the Q&A. So we're experimenting everyone a little bit here. I'm gonna take our panel off a spotlight here, but if the panelists can hang on for a bit, We're gonna get a community reaction from Israel Juarez here, just to get your thoughts and what did you think about the panel? What's your expertise? I'm a big believer in that there's a lot of expertise in the community as well too. So want to hear from some of you. Asking you to put some of those questions or some of those reactions. I might tap you in to get highlighted and come into the conversation as well too. But thoughts, comments, reactions, what's on top of your head as you've just heard and reacted to this panel. So Israel, what do you got?
So for me, I would say first, thank you guys for doing the work and stuff, a lot of everything. And also just being a young adult who went through natural leaders myself and growing up in the inner city, a lot what Juan and Erik were speaking about like Fresh Tracks being like an environment of itself. I feel like I was able to transition there when I was around other youth that I seen that came from my same community. I felt like, going my first trip with Fresh Track was to West Virginia. And I was like, I do not know what to expect. I thought it was gonna be like a lot of cows and stuff. Like, I don't know, it was just weird. But then I seen a lot of youth that were like, my same background, met Devin from Boston. And just listening to everything you guys were talking about, I could see how it shaped me today. As now I'm 25, I'm a young adult. And even now I try my best to try to take my brothers and sisters to the outdoors, because in that, just in the environment you're in, sometimes it's toxic. And I could see they fall in certain patterns, but I want to reshape their mindset, as well as being the leader and coming from, opportunity youth. I have that background to influence, voice, and change in people in my community,
Thanks, Israel. So yeah, any thoughts or comments, questions, please plug them into there. Carolyn Mosley, you posted a question in there and I was about to tap you in the chat box, but would you want to hop in here real quick? I can tap you in a sec. So let us know if you're willing to hop in via video here, and I can tap you in.
Oops.
Carolyn?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. Thank you for having me, and thank you for this very informative session. I live in Eastwick. It's a southeastern part of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And the community that I live in, just to make a long story short, we are the poster child for environmental injustices. As Melody read, we are the product of a failed implementation of one of the largest urban renewal programs in the history of this nation. We are on the 5th largest Superfund site in the country, and we are in a repetitive flood zone. The city, Army Corps of Engineers, and whoever else have been studying a flood problem in this community for 20 years with no results. People have been flooded multiple times, some up to 10 times. Some are paying flood insurance premiums of up to $1,000 a month. We almost lost 2 lives recently with Tropical Storm Isaias. We were not awarded a declaration of disaster. There has been a few communities and other organizations who have come to help us to try to write grants for, reaching out to philanthropic organizations. So far, we've only managed to raise about $40,000. We have over 300 people who were affected. We have some people who went through the winter with no heat, no hot water. We need national attention to this issue. We are tired. We need help from any resource or any organization that's out there that's willing to help us. This has got to stop. What can we do? We are organized. We have 300 people who are just, clamoring to get help. They're saying enough is enough, no more. We have other sections of the community where the cancer rate is so high from those contaminated landfills, but nobody does anything. We have people whose homes are sinking because the city allowed the developer to put their foundations on silt. Some of them can't even get in and out of the doors, close the windows.
Yeah.
We need the national spotlight. That's where we are now. We're trying to work on a docu-video and raise money for that at the same time. What can somebody do to help us? What's a good course of action here?
Yeah, well, without knowing all the details, Carolyn, I'll just say that I'm willing to get on a conversation with you and figure out how we can, you're getting a spotlight here, and
Yes.
I think it's one of the opportunities about being a part of the Aspen Institute is to share that spotlight and to share that platform as well too. So
Thank you.
at least this is in the very minimum, the very least that I can do right now, but happy to connect with you afterwards and discuss that further. But I'll
Thank
share
you.
with, I'll turn it over to some of my fellow panelists if they have any ideas, any thoughts, any reactions.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, Carolyn, thank you for your story. I mean, I still think we are a long way from most of the American public understanding the story that you just told, the history of environmental justice. So I would invite the president or the vice president or someone from the administration to come visit. We need more attention, as you said, on what happens at the confluence of all of these cumulative impacts, whether it's a Superfund site and the constant flooding and the people being forced from their homes as a result of extreme weather. And so that invitation to tour the impacts, just like when President Obama went to Alaska, is a game changer because it brings the press corps along. It allows people to understand what the need is. And if we're going to actually target 40% of the resources from what the American Jobs Package or whatever next round of help is actually passed by Congress, we're going to have to tell the story of the communities that need it and should receive it. And as you said, I can't imagine a place more in need than what you've just described. So whether it's Cecilia Martinez or someone else from CEQ, I think there's lots of ways to see if you could. Obviously, they're very busy and they can't visit every place, but it's definitely worth a shot.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that. So I'm going to ask our panelists to come back here. I'm a big fan of NPR. Yes, I'm that guy. And one of my favorite shows there is Code Switch. So I am going to ask you this last question, and then we'll wrap it up. What's a song that is giving you life right now, and a thought about why? And so, Melody, I'll bring you back for a quick minute here, but give you all a second to think about it. For me, it's I just became a naturalized citizen March 25th. I should add that. Thank y'all. Been a long journey, and the whole time I was playing Hamilton the remix tapes. Immigrants Get the Job Done. So that's the song that's given me life, and the one I was playing as I was getting ready to take my oath of citizenship. So, Christy.
I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to name one. I have like a whole soundtrack that we call the kids playlist that has been on endlessly. And since I have terrible taste in music and I'm kind of like a 16-year-old girl that likes pop music, I feel like Hard Times, which is one of the songs on there, will be what I associate with this entire past year. And I can just think of my kids singing it at the top of their lungs in the back seat of the car. So that's a good thing, because they're not yelling at me and saying mommy over and over again.
Nice. Erik.
Well, it's interesting. Ever since the pandemic hit, nature's become even more important than it already was in my life. But I take a walk with my husband twice a day, and every day it's sunny, which I'm always really appreciative of because I love the sun. I can't get enough of Bill Withers and Lovely Day. And then especially when Bill Withers passed, I've just been diving back into his whole songbook and just appreciating him in general. And so I've been listening to him a lot, partly because I just need to transport myself into that space every day, and it really helps me sort of get through the day. So that's kind of what's been on my mind lately.
Awesome. Thanks, Erik. And Melody.
I love this. Well, at one, I'm thinking we all need to get together because we've got a lot of similar musical tastes. I listen to the Hamilton soundtrack so much, particularly when I'm working out, that my husband's just like, you have got to stop. You're driving me crazy. So there's that. Bill Withers, which I love in part because my husband said, lovely day. Whenever he hears it, he thinks of me, which I love. But I was also just thinking about a walk that I took recently, and in part, it fits this conversation because I was just marveling at how beautiful it was. I was just like, things were blooming. It was just extraordinary. And I just felt so connected to nature. But I pulled up just now, I was looking at what I was listening to, which was everything from over and over. I was listening to jazz. So I was listening to Dave Brubeck and some Coltrane and stuff, but I was also listening to Katy Perry and Roar, just because I love, like, that's my, like, I'm taking this on. One of those for me, Lin-Manuel Miranda. I was listening to Kathleen Battle. My musical tastes are all over the place. It's hard for me to pick one song, but all of those fit different things that I was feeling as I was taking this amazing walk, or as I listened to music in the morning.
Beautiful. With that, we come to the end of our time together in community. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the attendees for your time. And if you're watching and recording, thank you for sticking with us as well too. The time is the most precious resource that we have in life. So thank you for spending it with us. With that, thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.